Okay, let's start, and people will continue to join us. I'm Riyad Bahour. I'm the coordinator of the Global Studies program here at Sac City. I'm really happy to welcome you to our last day of Reimagining the Future Earth and Global Justice Days at Sac City. One of the ideas behind this program was that after 2 years of pandemic, that we would seek to reconnect to our communities, both locally and globally, and learn more about the world around us. And this session is actually a really perfect one with the theme or the title, Can the Mediterranean Save Europe? Inclusion, Exclusion, and Belonging in Contemporary Italy, with two distinguished scholars in Italian studies, transnational Italian studies from the University of California in Santa Barbara. Professor Claudio Fogu is an author of two books. The most recent one is The Fishing Net and the Spiderweb, Mediterranean Imaginaries and the Making of Italians, as well as numerous articles and initiatives that he's involved with. And Professor Stephanie Malia-Holm is a professor of Italian studies at UCSB as well, and author of Empire's Mobius Strip, Historical Echoes in Italy's Crisis of Migration and Detention, and The Beautiful Country, Tourism, and the Impossible State of Destination Italy. You can tell from these titles that their work centers Italian studies, not only for understanding Italy, but for understanding the world around Italy as well through the lens of Italy. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Claudio to get us started, and then he will be followed by Stephanie, and we'll have time for discussion afterwards. Claudio, welcome.
Thank you, Riyad, and thanks everybody for being here. It is a really exciting opportunity to sort of bring some ideas that I and Stephanie have been working on for many years, and that are really reforming very much our view of Italian studies, but our views of nation states, and so largely applicable to many other settings. And in this case, we really wanted to kind of confront the very idea of Europe, and sort of I wanted to talk a little bit about how this articulation between the Mediterranean and Europe has been historically, and how it can be turned around in directions that are more fruitful and maybe take into consideration a larger set of options. So I'm going to share my screen with you, a portion of my screen, so that I can hopefully be able to talk to you. I hope you can all see it. Is it visible?
Looks good, yes.
Good, excellent. So of course, this title is a very provocative title. In 20 minutes, I'm not going to give any answer to that question, obviously, but the question really is for us to kind of think about the premises of this idea. I mean, the premises is that we really need to stop thinking about Europe or the Mediterranean as kind of, or any other entity as just a stable entity. So these are all meta-geographical entities, they're ideas. So this is very much a talk that will take seriously the fact of these being imaginary projections. And so I will, in this context, argue that we should endow both Europe and the Mediterranean of the equal kind of possibility of being both continents, in the sense that they contain. They both are meta-geographical entities. I'm just giving you like a sample of images. I mean, think about, the political map of United Europe. Is that Europe? I mean, it's missing Switzerland. It's missing a few Balkan states. It's missing a few states up north and England. I mean, come on. Is that Europe? Or, of course, in the 17th century, 18th century, like, let's look at that beautiful anthropomorphic map of Europe, which saw Europe as Christendom. And so Christendom is also, represented like a bishop elongating And so the north is the cap at the time, which was, of course, the kingdom of Spain that saw itself as the head of Christendom. So you can see how many imaginings even there. And then if we just look at but even if we go directly to geography, I mean, what is the geography of the Mediterranean telling us? Is the Black Sea part of the Mediterranean or not? We can't really tell because geographically it is as enclosed as other seas that we see. Why would that not be part of it? And the Adriatic would be. The openings are almost the same. So what we have is ideas that are shaping our understanding. And these ideas, of course, have historical beginnings. And our historical beginning here is a very telling and interesting one. It is the myth of the Europa, the myth of the daughter of the king of Phoenicia. And here we have a few cities that Riyad and I actually visited. And so we have Byblos and Sidon and Tyre, which were the ancient kingdom of Phoenicia. And the myth was about Zeus, the king of the Greeks, I mean, the king god of the Greeks, actually kidnapping assuming the shape of a bull and kidnapping the beautiful Europa from the coastline of Phoenicia onto the island of Crete. So the beginning of the myth of Europa is totally Mediterranean. There is no Europa. It's only the Mediterranean, but it is a very peculiar Mediterranean because it already speaks to us of an idea of Mediterranean that is the one that I want to talk to you about today. It is about a Mediterranean that is understood as one of interactions among different populations that exchange their gods and their princes and kings and daughters of kings. And of course, there is kidnap, and whether it is rape or kidnap, it's still a question of whose interpretation you're looking at. But basically, what you have is Phoenicia and Greece being basically united into a story of interaction, a story of syncretism, a story of creolization, basically, that we would call it today. And this is precisely the kind of Mediterranean that I want to talk to you about a little bit, because scholars in this last generation have been looking back at this ancient world and also at the idea of the Mediterranean no longer as just a space that was there to be traversed by empires, but as a space that constructed itself just very much like we think of networks. So maybe it is the age of the internet that has influenced scholars to think through the web and through the net metaphors. And I'm certainly plead guilty to that, having written a book that is entitled The Fishing Net and the Spider Web. I actually entitled that way because I was hoping it would end up in the information and computer science place in the libraries, so that it would get a lot of people looking at it, but that's a joke. But what I'm trying to say is that what we have is a very network theory idea of the Mediterranean that corresponds to very specific actual historical ages. And the three main characteristics that scholars attribute to networks are the idea of networks as being syncretic, being creolizing, as we make it, this word as basically the crossing of the insertion of elements of different cultures inside each other. Syncretic means to actually add different cultures, one on top of the other or one inside the other. So there's two processes that are similar, but also distinct in forms. And also the most important one, the fractal, the fact that a network system tends to reproduce itself as network. And so it tends to reproduce networks of networks of networks of networks. So it tends to create cultures that are organized around the idea of a network. And this is a very important issue because, of course, it comes back to the strong sort of polarization that I want to suggest to you today. But basically, these three forms can be mapped onto the history of the Mediterranean by looking at the ancient archaic emporia, the network of the Phoenicians, the Etruscans, and the Greeks. And then, of course, the important moment of the Greek polis, in which very sort of important centers became the more, the knots, the kind of foundational centers of distribution, as we could think about a distributed or decentralized network of Amazon, for example. And finally, the Roman Imperium. This is the network that we know best, the network that in a way has survived and become dominant because it's the network of empire. It's the kind of fish of spider web. You can see it immediately, the difference between the kind of fishing net of the distributed network and the spider web of the Roman Empire. And this is really where I wanted to get you guys to reflect just with these notions to the idea that the dominant view of the Mediterranean was set by the Romans in terms of calling this sea Mare Nostrum, our sea. So territorializing it, making it part of a territory that was under control. So this idea has survived and has really showed up also at the time when the Mediterranean as a noun was finally attached to that sea, a time that Professor Stephanie Malliaholm has demonstrated was the time of empire building, of a new empire building, of the Spanish Empire building, and its fight against the Ottoman Empire. So the history of the name is very much tied to the history of empire. And I would contrast it immediately with the Arabic name that you can see on my slide, the White Sea. The White Sea is the name of the gaze of from the land from the North Africa towards the sea. It's the name that is given to a sea that reflects the light of the sun and looks white rather than looking than appearing blue. So this is a name that tells us about the looking from land towards the sea. It's the kind of appropriation and a sense of belonging to the sea. And this is precisely where I want to reread this Mediterranean from the name of the White Sea, a way in which basically we shift away from the history in the Mediterranean, the history of Europe in the Mediterranean, the history of empires in the Mediterranean. And by empires, I include also nation states that I would rename empire states, to a Mediterranean history of Europe. And this Mediterranean history of Europe would end up, I think, helping us shifting away from the discourses that we're caught with, the discourses of identity, towards discourses of belonging. The discourse of belonging is an aspiration, it's a sense of be and longing. The word itself gives us a sense of movement towards something. Now, of course, this belonging it's not always positive, as slaves belong to their masters, and slavery was as much part of the Mediterranean as the idea of belonging to God. So I'm not putting a kind of spin in which there is only bad empire versus good belonging, bad identity. I'm just saying that reorientation is very important because we can't really stay just with one pole, and we seem to be stuck with the pole of empire in our thinking about identities at every level of our discourse. And this is where I'm sorry if I'm just going to try to just, and Riyad, you stop me anytime because I tend to maybe make it too long, but this is where I wanted to introduce you to just a few images of Italy as certainly a central player, but also a metaphor of this Mediterraneanness, because if you think about it, as a country, Italy was really a kind of double image of the Mediterranean, fragmented, divided between East and West by a strong mountainous ridge for its history, and basically developing around different cultural units and different languages for many, many, many centuries. So in a way, and of course, playing a disproportionate role in terms of the land in between the sea of the Mediterranean because of the birth of Catholicism in Italy, of course, of Christianity, and the Roman Empire, and as we will see, other things. But when you look at the maps of Italy, and I'm giving you here a few of them, you can see the beauty of reversing our outlook. And you can see how, for example, on the upper right, looking at the screen, you have this image of Italy reversed. And of course, the north is where usually the south would be. And this gives us immediately the idea that we are in a map of Europe in which the south still counts as the center of gravity of the Christian world and the Muslim world. You can see a map of the Muslim map of Europe in the middle top. And what I want you to notice is the amazing presence of islands in the Red Sea. The Red Sea, which you see in below Arabia and around is, and then the ocean, it's full of islands and it's connected to the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean is no longer isolated, it's a sea of islands. And in this sea of islands, we find the island that we call Italy. Yes, not the peninsula, but the island, because these maps clearly indicate Italy always as an island. Look at also the big green one on the bottom left. It actually isolates Italy. It makes it into looking at just a mountainous bunch of mountains and cities in between the sea, and it looks like an island. This just to say that when we come to more modern maps, the last one that you see on the bottom, Italy is represented, its borders are represented entirely and only by ports and harbors. This is the idea of the continent. The Mediterranean continent has its own nation states. They are called seas with their names, but they don't have borders. They're shifting borders and they're liquid borders, but it has its own capital. Those capitals are called islands, and those islands are connected to a border that it shares with the other continent of Europe, and those harbors belong to both one and the other. They cannot be seen as belonging to only one system. So these are the idea that I'm playing with, and I just want to give you just a couple of last ideas about how to think about a fishing net Europe. Think about the birth of Christianity, and you're immediately in the realm of actually a fishing net. The Christian traditions of the letters of St. Paul to the Corinthians, to everybody, the ones that many fundamentalists keep reciting, they all speak of a Mediterranean community. There would be no Christianity at all without a Mediterranean space of interaction. Now, of course, Rome then became the kind of centralized system of Catholicism. And the slave trade, yes, the slave trade in the Mediterranean was as much part of the Mediterranean as it was the merchant culture of the maritime republics. And certainly that's the the two were fully reversible. And that's where the contrast and conflict and also exchange and creolization was endemic to the Mediterranean. And we can see it in the reversibility of trader to slave trader, and of sailors to slave. It was a constant danger and shift, but something that was part of the opportunities and at the same time, the difficulties of the Mediterranean. This is where I just would have started talking about the Mediterranean history of Italy, and I'll just make it only into this couple of points here. I just want you to think about, of course, you think of Italy, you think about pizza immediately, and the pizza, the famous pizza margherita. Yes, that's the symbol of the Italian flag. It's got basil, which is green, and then it's got mozzarella, it's white, and then it's red. And I'm not joking, it was created for that purpose. But before we get to pizza, Italy actually was known as the land of Arlequin, of the Commedia dell'arte. That's where the identification of Italians with gestures is coming from. But Commedia dell'arte was a form of theater in which characters didn't speak the same language, communicated by gestures, communicated just like in the Mediterranean space, a Mediterranean space where there was only one language that everybody spoke. It was called lingua franca. And it was a language that was made up of Arab words, of Italian words, of Spanish words, of French words. And it functioned as the only way that people could actually cross their cultural barriers. That's what was identified as the first Italian language. And of course, the maritime republics of Italy and its kingdom of Sicily, of the two Sicilies in the south. This is the heritage that Italy holds in hope of reconnecting with it. And we are working with Stephanie and with many other scholars to rekindle this Mediterranean history of Italy, which should be enlarged, of course, to a Mediterranean history of Europe, one in which the sea is no longer a mare nostrum, but it doesn't become just a mare aliorum, that is a sea of others, of dangerous others invading Europe. This is unfortunately what now Stephanie will certainly talk about, the contemporary situation that we know, in which the other is seen as the refugee and as the danger to Europe. We need to reverse that, and we are trying to do it through, of course, this kind of ideas. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to talking with you after.
Thank you, Claudio. We look forward to it too. And Stephanie, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Riyadh. Thank you for the gracious and wonderful invitation to be here today. And thanks to all of you who are in the audience. I'm going to share my screen here. See if everybody can see that. So I want to pick up where Professor Fogu left off about what does this excision of the Mediterranean mean for Italy as a nation state, this excision of the sea and this privileging of territory in terms of creating a nation state and in terms of creating the conditions of belonging to the nation state. And I also wanted to ask the question of what does it mean for citizenship in our day today? So before we do that, I wanted to go back a little bit to look at the beginnings of democracy and the creation of citizenship in ancient Greece. And here we have, you could see the etymology of the word democracy from the ancient Greek demokratia, meaning, power of the people. And as Professor Fogu noted, the polis is actually central to this. The polis, which means city-state, but has a more expansive meaning of being an administrative unit of governance. And this was what Professor Fogu was referring to as being the heart of the creolizing network in the Mediterranean. And in ancient Athens, the polis was considered a precursor to the modern nation state. It met all of the definitions, it had its narratives, its symbols, had a geography, it was defined by difference. And I had the very good fortune many years ago of being able to live in Athens for a time. And every week or so, I would go down to the ancient agora underneath the Acropolis to walk through the space where democracy was born. I wanted to go and see it and stand there on my own. And it was interesting, I learned in the Agora Museum there that in ancient Greece, there was this idea, let me get to the next slide here, This is a slide of where the Tholos stood in the Agora. Here you can see the Acropolis there. This is where democracy was born, right? This is where citizens would meet and they would decide on how to govern the polis. And one element of that governance was a phenomenon called ostrakismos, ostracism, in which it's where we get our English word ostracism. And almost every year, the people would meet to vote to expel a citizen. And they would write the name of these citizens on these potsherds. You could see the Greek characters on there. And that would be the person they would vote with these potsherds to expel this person from the polis, this person who was considered a collective threat to democracy. So at the heart of democracy, we have this practice of exclusion. We have a practice of exclusion where it's supposed to be this power from the people, that's inclusive power. At the very beginning, there was already this move to exclude. And so the actions of exclusion and inclusion are fundamental to the very concept of democracy itself. And at the heart of these actions is the exercise of power. And this relates back to what Professor Fogu was saying about empire, right, and the exercise of power. It's also important to the concept of citizenship, an idea of who is included or who belongs and who doesn't belong to an imagined community, to a nation state, and even more importantly, who has the power to negotiate that belonging. One other thing I thought was very interesting when I was living and walking through the Agora was that the border of the Tholos, which is where ancient democracy took place. Tholos is literally the hut where people would go and sit in and vote. The border of the Tholos was a river, the river Erodos. And you can see very vaguely here the path. It no longer exists, but this is the path it used to take through Athens. And it made me realize that the borders of democracy were already very fluid from the start. And we might think about a proposition that democracy has a liquid fundament that links back to the liquid continent of the Mediterranean, just in the same way that Professor Fogu was arguing. So in addition to Greece, we owe our understanding of modern citizenship, it was a great debt to ancient Rome as well. Citizenship in ancient Rome was exclusionary, as well as gradated, meaning there were different levels of citizenship. One could be a full citizen, a civis, which you had all the rights to own property, to marry, to travel, to vote, to hold office. Of course, this was limited to men. Women were not allowed to be full citizens. And then there were lesser forms of citizenship, sort of partial citizenship, that included some of these rights. Some could own property, you could marry, you could travel, and they're all grouped under this title of peregrinus. And I just put a couple of examples here: the Latini, the Jus Latini, the Jus Soci, and how they had limited rights to travel, to marry, et cetera, et cetera. Also in ancient Rome, we had slavery was widespread, and slaves did not hold any rights. They were considered property under Roman law. And what's interesting in Rome, slavery was not based on race, but rather based on one's foreignness, one's otherness, one's identification as an outsider. So slaves were prisoners of war, people who had been kidnapped and captured, they were brought from elsewhere. And typically slaves would labor in the home and in the fields and building capital projects like the Roman Forum or the Colosseum. What was interesting about slavery in ancient Rome is that Roman slaves also had the possibility of being freed, which is what we call manumission. You could work your way to freedom, you could buy your freedom. And once freed, these quote unquote freedmen could hold partial Roman citizenship. They could vote, but they couldn't hold office, but they could also marry. Their children, however, could be full Roman citizens. So slavery in ancient Rome was not something that was passed down from generation to generation, but could be something that one could work or purchase their way out of. And that in the next generation, their children and their children's children could achieve full Roman citizenship. And freedom was a privilege, not a right. And what's interesting in ancient Rome, freedom was a privilege, not a right. But the founding fathers of the United States inverted this saying by saying that freedom was a fundamental human right, even though, despite the fact that the founding paradox of our country was that it was built upon the backs of enslaved people. So there is a reversal here that happens in terms of inclusion, exclusion, and belonging in the United States. And that also happens around this very idea of citizenship. Just in the same way that citizenship existed in full and partial forms in ancient Rome, they also still exist. It still exists in full and partial forms today. And the condition of inclusion and exclusion that's constitutive of democracy is still at work today, as the conditions under which individuals belong to a nation state also varies. And I wanted to take a look here at our an example here of for us here in the United States and how conditions of citizenship vary. So in the US, we have what's called jus solis, or birthright citizenship. And if you're born here, you're automatically become a citizen. However, if you're born in a US territory, you're not. You're considered a US national. And here I put it, so here I wanted this, there's this, this picture is taken from a story in the LA Times, where this is a man holding up his passport. He's a resident of American Samoa. He is considered a national, not a citizen. You can see in his passport, it says the bearer is a United States national and not a United States citizen. So for US nationals, they don't have the right to vote in elections. They are represented in Congress by people who don't have the right to vote, but merely observe, right? And so this is a kind of, yet here is a person holding a US passport, and it's a kind of limited form of citizenship. And to give you another example of how this works in the US, perhaps some of you have been to Washington, DC, and you've seen this license plate that says end taxation without representation. There's been various versions of this throughout the years, but for people who are born and continuing to reside in the District of Columbia, US citizenship is conferred with the right to vote, but without representation in Congress. So there's no representation for the people in the nation's capital in Congress. So here we have just different forms of rights that can be exercised under this broad umbrella of citizenship. And so here we have two main types of citizenship: jus solis, again, citizenship by soil, also known as birthright citizenship. That's what we have here in the US. And jus sanguinis, or citizenship by blood. That's what exists in Italy. So in Italy, if you are a direct descendant of a grandparent or a parent, you have a right to citizenship, Italian citizenship, because of your bloodline. So we have these very interesting situations that come up where there are children of migrants who are second generation, third generation children in Italy who are born and raised there, who have gone to school there, who speak the language perfectly, but who have no claims to citizenship because their parents remain undocumented. But at the same time, another example is you might have someone who lived in Brazil their entire life, and has never set foot in Italy, doesn't speak a word of Italian, but whose grandparent was Italian, and therefore they can claim citizenship and apply for an Italian passport. And let me see here. Oh, I'll go back here. So these are just a couple of the forms. So today in Italy, on the right-hand side, we have jus sanguinis, which is full citizenship. And then for people who want to apply for citizenship, these are kind of limited forms of citizenship that exists that one can apply for. But at this point, I want to show you a brief clip because these paths to citizenship and these kind of labyrinthine bureaucratic rules of who can belong and who doesn't plays out amongst Italy's people who are considered Italy's internal others, that is Roma, who's pejoratively known as gypsies. And I want to show you a clip from a movie called Container 158 that was produced in 2013. And you're going to see a series of Roma talking about the idea of citizenship. And you're going to watch, we'll watch these scenes together. It's about 3 minutes long, and then come back and make a few points from there. So if I can stop sharing this screen, and then I will share the next screen. Hold on 1 second. Okay, can you all see that screen? Okay. And
siamo vagabondi, ecco siamo vagabondi di salone. Sapevo italiano, c'avevo la carta d'identità, c'avevo tutto, c'avevo. Non sono italiano, sono zingaro. Che devi fare? Perché se non c'hai documenti, c'hai niente, ti fermano la polizia, ti portano per niente, ti portano in questura, 2 o 3 ore. Quando c'hai i documenti c'hai tutto. Adesso voglio fare il pantettino per motorino. Non so se lo posso fare. Non lo posso. Vabbè, ma chi ti ferma? Chi ti chiede il pantettino per motorino? Nessuno.
Tu mettere un pochettino d'acqua perché qua è al massimo.
Quella è al massimo, però
Sì.
cold, fredda. Quando è calda mi sa che... Ah, tu dicevi...
Però adesso ci metto il dito, non è così, diciamo. Manca mezza bottiglietta. Tu lo metti.
Ma voi la macchina non ce l'avete? No. E con tutte queste macchine che vedete non potete comprarne una.
Io non ce l'ho ancora.
Ah, tu non ce l'hai?
Non ce l'ho.
E quindi non puoi prendere la patente, fare niente. Una domanda per una casa.
Niente.
Non risulti.
Risulta che è nato qui in Italia, però non risulta che c'è la cittadinanza italiana. Non è il diritto di nascita, qui è il diritto di famiglia. Se tuo padre è cittadino italiano, oppure tu puoi essere cittadino italiano. Però quando sei minorenne puoi fare tutto, non è che ti vietano di frequentare le scuole o cose, perché il diritto dell'infante, come si chiama?
Sì, dell'infanzia.
Dell'infanzia puoi andare a scuola, puoi fare tutto come per altri ragazzini. Però quanto cresci, quanto diventi maggiorenne...
Appena diventi maggiorenne, sparisci.
Fatti i cazzi su qua, ci dicono.
L'altro giorno sono andato alla posta, no? Per prendere la carta Roma. Poi ride, sono stato là, gli ho dato tutti i documenti, dice, ah, ma lei c'ha scritto Sassuolo Modena, è cittadino italiano, mi faceva. E io gli dicevo, guardi, io sono nato in Italia, però non sono ancora cittadino italiano. Ma nei documenti c'è scritto Italia! Ho capito, però io ho cittadinanza montenegrina. Dice, dove sta Sassuolo? Sta a Montenegro. Ho detto, ma state scherzando? State dicendo per davvero? Cioè, Sassuolo sta in Italia. Sta a Modena. È una provincia di Modena.
Servino Kusovic. E tu tuo?
No, è il mio cugino.
Ah, vabbè. Tu sei Brenda Sancano, vero? Sì. E c'hai il passaporto?
No,
Non hai il passaporto.
no, nessun documento.
Da dove provieni te? Visto che sei nata a Roma, i tuoi genitori da dove vengono?
Da Montenegro.
Montenegro. Da Nikšić?
Sì, Nikšić.
Ok, Nikšić. Né papà né mamma hanno un passaporto?
Mio padre ha un passaporto, ma è scaduto. L'hanno cancellato dal Montenegro.
Allora, per avere cittadinanza italiana tu devi avere una residenza ininterrotta da quando sei nata
Sì, ce
fino
l'ho.
a quando non hai compiuto 18 anni.
Ce l'ho.
Tutti i tuoi genitori, quando sei nata te, dovevano essere regolarmente presenti sul territorio nazionale. Tutti i tuoi genitori devono avere sempre avuto permesso di soggiorno per 18 anni e cittadinanza si chiede dal 18° fino al 19° anno di vita, non dopo. Unico modo di avere un permesso di soggiorno, adesso visto che hai 19 anni, che non si iscritta nel paese d'origine, puoi chiedere a polidia e poi si chiede permesso di soggiorno per attesa a polidia.
Stop sharing this, get back to, oh, hold on one second. Okay, get back to this presentation here. So as you saw with this clip, there are the people who were speaking were caught in a sort of limbo. Born and raised in Italy, as you can see, they're fluent in Italian, but you heard Sasha say, you know, if I had papers, I would have everything, so, but I don't have them and I don't have anything, right? And Brenda, you can see her face almost deflate when the administrator is telling her all of these labyrinthine requirements that she would have to go through in order to even just apply for citizenship. At the end, she has 1 year to apply between 18 and 19 after she's fulfilled all of these requirements, but then she didn't do that at 19 years old. She has to declare statelessness in order to even just apply. And whether or not that application goes through would be, you know, that depends on the context. And I know I'm running out of time here. I just wanted to briefly note, if I have more time, these bureaucratic constellations and this limbo of citizenship have historical roots in Italy, and they have historical roots in particular in the colonies, in Italy's colonial experience and in its imperialist initiatives in the early 20th century. So there were Italy held colonies in North Africa and Libya, held colonies in East Africa and Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia, as well as in the Aegean with Rhodes and the Dodecanese, and a small concession in Tianjin in China. And in particular, amongst the Mediterranean colonies, that is in Rhodes and in Libya, there was a special form of citizenship that colonial subjects could apply for that gave limited rights, and that, to my mind, set a precedent for this very bureaucratic and labyrinthine process of these gradated citizenship that exists today in Italy. So I think I'm out of time. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you, Professor Holm, and that was very interesting. I have a question to get us out of the gate, just a very particular one. You know, when I was listening to that long list of conditions, what came to mind was that whoever created this so-called path to citizenship created essentially something to check off a box to say that Italy had a path to citizenship, but constructed it in such a way that it would be impossible to achieve, right? So having the path to citizenship means you're civilized, you have, you know, you respect certain rights, etc. but then it's not really a path to citizenship, which do people actually ever become citizens this way?
Very few, very few. It's very limited. The cases I know of are, predominantly American children whose parents have been living there for decades, who have had all of their documents in order, right? That have both the financial and the cultural capital to navigate a bureaucratic system such as this. I would note also that that path to citizenship, the requirements keep changing. So it's a moving target. The goalposts keep moving. So every year there's some sort of new regulation. So those two forms I put up, the jus soli temporato and jus culturae, each of those have different requirements and they do change. So you're right, it's a quote unquote path, but it's in practice, it's very, very difficult to achieve.
To bring this back to the Mediterranean as a kind of connector, and on the topic of citizenship and migrants, of course, a lot of migrants land in Italy, right? As they land in Europe, and you hear some Italians saying, even those who say, well, we're not against migrants coming to Europe, we just think that Italy is bearing, much more responsibility, and we're an easy target for Northern Europeans who don't want migration to kind of make us bear the brunt of policing the migration, et cetera. So there's tension kind of within Europe around migration and the special role that Italy plays being part of the Mediterranean and its geographic proximity. Can you talk a little bit about that and how Italy is maybe changing, right? Italy is also experiencing underpopulation in rural areas. So some rural areas in southern Italy have welcomed migrants, et cetera. And the famous case of the mayor who was kind of prosecuted for declaring his town a kind of free zone for migrants.
Yeah. Claudio, do you want to respond, or would you like me to start and then?
You start.
Well, I think what's very interesting about the so-called migration crisis today, first of all, many of the practices of sequestration and detention, exclusion were perfected under Italian colonialism, right? So it's not anything new. It has historical roots. In fact, I would say some of them were even perfected earlier in the moment of unification and against the Southerners in particular. So Italy is unified in 1861. In 1872, there's a law that's passed called the Pica Law that makes it a crime to essentially cast aspersions along the new nation states. So you have people who may have said something against the king who are then flogged and executed. There's a system of carceral islands that's established at this moment, and it's this idea that that the South is unruly and barbaric and uncivilized and needs to be tamed, so to speak, in the name of the nation. A lot of those stereotypes that are created in that moment are also applied to migrants today. And I think one thing that's very interesting about Italy is that across the political spectrum, there's been a rigidification against an anti-immigration sentiment, I should say. There's a rigidification against migration that changed in the late 90s, early 2000s. So at the beginning of the 90s, when there were the first waves of migrants coming from the Balkans, there was very much this attitude of, let's welcome migrants into the country. We were once immigrants abroad to the US, to Canada, to South America. And so it is our turn to pay it forward. That shifts, right? That initial attitude of welcoming shifts in the early 2000s and becomes this very hard line across the political spectrum. But I think I wanted to turn it over to Professor Fogu, who might tell us more about the South and this idea of the South and how that's playing into the idea of migration today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I would actually also go back to the previous question, Riyadh, because they're really interconnected. Even the very establishment of the jus sanguinis, so of the citizenship of blood, is related to the shock of unification, which produced the most massive migration in the history of modernity from Italy towards South America and North America. That migration started becoming the migration of the South that rejected its being unified to the rest of the country. And the one major element that the state devised was that of allowing people with dual citizenship, so to become both members of the new country where they went and maintain Italian citizenship. So the jus sanguinis was established to keep the bleeding of emigration. So think how incredibly powerful that resonance is still today, with locking Italy into that kind of privilege to immigrants. Now, this is a perfect example of what many theorists have called the, sort of the decolonization, the process of coloniality, where Southerners in Italy have, in a certain sense, been forced to either endorse an even more harsher kind of position towards migration. So you might have a phenomenon of many voting for the League, or being very adamantly against, because they need to be constantly forced to be looking like Northerners. They need to prove themselves to belong to the nation by now being the ones that exclude. So you have this tremendous tension between absorption of migrants within an informal economy, which has always characterized the South because of its conditions of poverty. So you see a kind of the criminal and informal economy utilizing the migrant path to sort of absorb these people. And then you find a kind of elite of people that denounce even more harshly than Northerners migration, because they see themselves as being pushed back into it. But what you're right about is the rural communities, and also the communities that have absorbed migrants in their midst. And like the examples that you were referring to, those are beacons, and those are amazingly powerful. And those are the ones that really keep this sort of hope of a Mediterranean framework of that fishing net that I was talking about present. In very difficult conditions, extremely difficult, because they have both the state and the pressure of conforming to the rules of Europe that is bearing on Southerners twice as much as it does on others. So it's a kind of pressure that has been absorbed for over a century to perform and to no longer belong to the Mediterranean. And that's what's really at tension.
Even at a time that Italy brands the Mediterranean-ness of its culture and identity to sell to tourists, right? While
absolutely.
And
this is the example that Stephanie's book makes most, and I will leave it to her to tell you about Lampedusa, because it's the perfect example of what you're talking about.
Okay, and also there's a question in the chat that you both might want to look at.
Sure. Well, I'll address the question first and then tell you a little bit about Lampedusa. So why, the question is, most of the Italian immigrants who immigrated here to the US were Southern Italians. Why did Southern Italians dislike unification? I think if we study the history of the south of Italy, it is very much, as Professor Fogu notes, it's both syncretistic and Creole at the same time. There were a number in its history, parts of it were Greek, Arab, Norman, Bourbon, and so on and so forth. And at the moment of unification, for those in the South, because unification was very much a northern phenomenon from Turin, from Piedmont in the north, kind of in a sense, superimposing itself on the South. And to the South, it was just another form of colonization. Here's another colonizer, like the Greeks, like the Arabs, like the Normans. And so I don't know if it was dislike, but just a kind of perhaps a skepticism of, oh, here we go again. But to address the idea of Lampedusa that Riyad brought up, Lampedusa is an island that is technically, it's south of Sicily, and it's technically closer to Tunisia than it is to Italy, even though its administrative unit is in Sicily. And this is typically the island along the central Mediterranean route of migration, where people coming from East Africa and West Africa who transit the Sahara get on boats run by traffickers and land, cross the Mediterranean, land in Europe. And Lampedusa is very interesting because it is really the flashpoint for this migration crisis in the Mediterranean. At the same time, it was named as having the best beach in the world. It is a hot destination for luxury tourism. You go there, and there's this very strange juxtaposition between the apparatus of migration, where you see Coast Guard cutters and vans and the finance guard, and there's a detention center on the island. And in the middle of the island too, there's the wreckage of all of the boats that have either sunk or washed up on shore. And then on the other hand, you have, beach chairs and umbrellas and high-end seafood restaurants and Airbnbs. And, it's two worlds colliding that to me really represent the difference between those who can move by choice, like tourists, and those who are moved by force, like refugees and asylum seekers. And it's colliding at this one particular island.
Very, very stark situation there. We have time for one more question or comment for our guests.
While we wait for that, maybe I just wanted to address Alexandra its question in another way. One of the interesting aspect of this moment in which the Southerners leave, it's not immediate. Most actually of the immigration is from Northerners of Italy. So the shock of Italian unification is across the peninsula. And we're talking about that in 40 years' time, 1 out of 6 Italian males emigrates. So we're talking about 12 million total of immigrants from a nation that will have only 60 at some point. So we have a tremendous amount of immigration. And the interesting thing is that Southerners that arrive in North America, which is the more advanced country at the time, have an opportunity to mark the sign of Italy with Southernness. So while Italy unifies along this northern impositions, and the South is extracted from the Mediterranean, they bring their Mediterraneanness here. And so the pizza, the mafia, all of the identifications and the singing and the music, all of them, the film culture, it was all coming from Naples. So this is an extraordinary reversal. At the very same time as there is an image of Italy being made in Italy, there is another contrary one being made abroad. And that's often where we find in our courses with Professor Holm that we have this kind of double. That's why we wanted to create a transnational Italian studies major, because we look at the construction of Italianness on a global scale, not privileging either one image being made on the mainland or the others, or detaching them from each other. We look at them all in their interaction.
Fascinating. Thank you so much to both of you for amazing presentations and discussion. We could obviously go on more, and I encourage people who are interested to seek out the work of Drs. Fogu and Holm. And also maybe some of you would want to transfer to UCSB and take up Italian studies there. Thank you again, everyone, and thanks for coming. Unfortunately, we have to end exactly on time, but hopefully we'll have another opportunity in the future.
Thank you, Riyad, and thank
Thank-
everybody for being
Thank you
here.
so much.
Bye-bye.
Grazie mille.
Grazie.
Prego.